Good afternoon, folks. My name is Charlie Murphy. I'm a state rep from Burlington. Very good friends with Con Hurley. That's why I'm here today. And I currently serve as the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the State House on the House side. I wanted to talk a few minutes today, and I think I make out that clock, about sort of the process where we stand in the State House in terms of the FY10 budget. I want to touch a little bit on the FY09 budget, which we're still in the midst of as well. And I've been chairman about 2 months now when Speaker DeLeo was elected Speaker. Probably 2 weeks after that, he made his appointments, his leadership appointments, and he reached out to me and asked me to chair the Ways and Means. It's one of those jobs that everybody wants, and you can't really pick when you get it. But unfortunately, I get it in a time, economic time, that isn't the easiest. It's somewhat of a challenge, as you might say. But it's a job that, again, it's if you're a state rep, this is a job you want, so I'm thrilled to be there. So I jumped right into it. We were a little bit behind schedule with the budget, but I get into it and I immediately realized how bad things were on the state level. I follow the newspapers like everybody else, and you sort of have an idea things aren't going terribly well. But when you actually get into the minutia, and we got a state budget about that thick, and we went page by page, line item by line item, you realize how tricky things are, and that's the way it is. But that's okay, because that's life, and that's what we have to deal with. On the state side, as you may know, we have to balance a budget every year. So says our Constitution. On the federal side, they don't, and they don't. They borrow, which is a double-edged sword. I guess it's nice to be able to borrow to move forward, but it doesn't really help our kids and grandkids and whatnot. So we have to balance the budget, and I'm thrilled about that, quite frankly. It's just that this particular year is awful. I put a budget out, my committee put a budget out 2.5 weeks ago, with a projected $3.6 billion hole for FY10. Since then, it's gone up, so we're probably looking at $4 billion, call it, for FY10. The budget included about $1.8 billion in cuts off of FY09. It didn't include any draw from the rainy day fund, the stabilization fund, which everybody hears about, and it used quite a bit of federal money, the stimulus money, which is nice to have, but that's a double-edged sword as well, because next year we're going to have about half of what we had this year. The following year we're going to have zero. If the economy doesn't come back accordingly, which I don't think anybody expects it to, then we really got a hole. So that's why I suggested we make a commitment, and I hope we stick to this commitment, that we don't touch the rainy day fund, because we're going to need it next year. We're really going to need it in FY12. So the budget I put out, and this is the dilemma that we're up against right now, was based on a consensus revenue that was determined last December. And this is the process. This isn't anything new. This is the way it works. December of the calendar year, the House, the Senate, and the administration get together to determine the consensus revenue for the following fiscal year. So we get together last December, back when I was not chairman of Ways and Means, and they determined, and they bring in a bunch of economists, and they all sit around and they try to prognosticate as to how things are going to be doing a year down the road. So by definition, it's not terribly accurate. The number they agreed on was a $19.53 billion consensus revenue. That's the money that we, back in December, thought we would be taking in FY10 and the various tax revenues. The budget I built was using the $19.53 billion, because that's the number I had, knowing that number wasn't terribly accurate, not sure exactly how inaccurate it is. But we moved forward for a bunch of reasons, time being one, and when I got appointed, we were a little behind the eight ball, so we had to move forward. And we had talked about unilaterally bringing down the consensus revenue for our purposes, and letting the Senate do their own thing. Again, we were just up against it with time, so we didn't. So we passed the budget. We'll put the budget out with a 19.53. We passed the budget last week. The Senate had a hearing, not a hearing, they had a meeting, they call it, yesterday, where it was sort of like the consensus revenue hearing that they do every year, but it was unilateral. They did it themselves. They brought in the same economists. I think the commissioner of DOR, she was there to talk about projections and whatnot. Bottom line is that the new number for FY10 is somewhere around $18 billion. So when you do quick math, the budget that we just passed last week is about $1.5 billion out of whack, depending on who you believe. But it's probably not too far from the truth. So what we're up against right now is the Senate is now going to release their budget, I think, next week, using, so the number that Steve Pangiatakis, who's the chair of the House Ways and Means, is going to use to build his budget is probably somewhere in the ballpark of $18 billion. And again, the number I used was $19.5 billion. So right out of the gate, their cuts are going to be worse. When my budget came out, people were horrified at the cuts. And as most of you know, the process is the administration comes out with their budget first in January. And they did that, and it was bad. Leslie Kerwin is the Secretary of Administration and Finance, very smart, very nice woman. And as I was moving forward with my budget, I sort of joked with her that people were going to love her budget when they see my budget. And sure enough, they did. But now I'm joking with Panagiotakis that people are going to love my budget when they see his budget. And it's true, because his is, I mean, mine was bad, his is going to be awful. But again, that's the process, and we're moving forward. So what we're going to do next is Panagiotakis and the Senate they're going to do their thing. The budget debate will be in a couple of weeks. And then every year we have a conference committee. And it's 3 reps and it's 3 senators, literally sit down at a table like this, and we go page by page through each budget. And we hammer out a compromise. And this is nothing new. This is the way it happens. This year I think there's more focus on it because of the numbers are just so volatile, and the tax projections are just through the floor. So I think more people are looking at it. But this is the way it works, and this is what we're going to do. So at the end of the day, we're going to have a FY10 budget that is significantly less than FY09 for obvious reasons. But as a result of that, the cuts are going to be to the bone, as they say. I mean, we're going to be cutting some pretty essential services, which is going to create the hue and cry, which happened when my budget came out to some degree, but it'll be worse when Steve's budget comes out. And then ultimately, when we get the budget done, and we hope to have it done on time, which is July 1st, to get it to the governor 3rd week in June, he has an opportunity to do his line item veto, get it back to us for consideration and final passage by July 1st. That's the hope. When that time comes, it's not going to be terribly attractive. But what I tell people is that this is not unique. Every state, I think 45 states in the country are going through the same issues we're going through. I mean, countries around the world are going through the same issues with their markets down 50%. Our market's getting hammered. It's truly a global economic crisis that we're all in the midst of. We're just looking at it from different angles. I'm in the State House, and you guys are doing the financial services, and you got academia, and it's different angles, but looking at the same problem. And that's something we just have to deal with. And what I've been telling members of the House as we put the budget out, and I literally did a little media tour around the state to editorial boards, and I called it the media tour of doom, because that's what it was. We went around and just said, hey, this is, things are awful, and we sort of talked about why they're awful. And but what I've been telling members is that we truly have to change our expectations in the building in terms of how we do business as a government. We're not going to be able to do the things that perhaps people are used to doing. Last week we debated the budget, and people, colleagues after colleague after colleague coming up to me looking for amendments, and their pitch was, well, we've always done this. We've done this for the last 15 years. And I sort of looked at them, I said, well, you got to give me something more than that, because that's not, that may have worked in the past when we had money and we were flush, but that's not a good lead. And we cut, I think, 54 line items completely out of the budget from '09, just gone, just wiped them off. Decimated various agencies and programs and secretariats across the board, and because we had to, and everybody was upset about it. Meeting with secretaries and commissioners, and they all come in, listen, if you cut here, we're going to have to lay off. If you cut here, we're going to lay off. And, I'd listen to them and, kick them out of my office and sort of say, yeah, I get it. I understand it's bad, but we can't just patch the holes because we can't. The money's just not there. And to get back to my other point, we have to balance the budget. So it's truly a different place in government. And that's the pitch I've been making to the members. And I know Steve Panagiotakis is making it to his members, that we just have to change how we do business. And I talk about the expectations internally, also externally. I meet with advocates and lobbyists. They all come to me for various things, and they want different things. And I've told them, I said, it's different. I mean, just because we've been doing it forever, just it's not going to fly. I mean, what is it you do? Is it effective? Can you do it for less? And how much less? Those are the conversations we're having now, and more often than not, it's just goodbye. We're cutting it because the money's not there. The expectation for the revenue for FY09, the projected revenue was $18.43 billion. That's for FY09. So FY10, I don't think anybody in this room expects growth in tax revenue. You look at capital gains. I mean, that's gone for, what, 3 years while everybody takes their losses. So that's going to be some time. And that was 2 years ago. There was 1.8, no, I think it was $2.2 billion that the state took in cap gains. FY10, the projection's about $300 million. So that's quite a swing. And now that's something we addressed in our budget, which I think is extremely important. We put a proposal, and the Speaker was behind this 100%, is moving forward, is that any capital gains, that 50% of the growth of capital gains from the previous year would immediately go into the rainy day fund. And that is something that's in our budget. I hope it's in Panagiotakis' budget, and I hope it becomes law, because that is something that we need. Talk about changing the way we do business. We can't move forward and just rely on capital gains as if they're going to keep being there, because they're not, and we're going to be in this situation again. I've always said that what I'd love to see is we get $4 billion into the rainy day fund as quickly as we can, and that's plus or minus the statutory cap on the rainy day fund. That's not to say we can't raise that cap, but as we sit here today, I'd love to get $4 billion there and just leave it there, because once we come out of this, and we will come out of this, I think we're all confident of that. Nobody knows when, but we will. We'll be back in this again. 10 years, 12 years, 8 years, whatever the number is. It's going to happen again. And it would be nice to have $4 billion at least sitting there so that we can try to even the waters out a little bit as we move forward and not be up against what we're up against now, which is just massive cuts. And I'm not, sitting here, I'm not blaming anybody. I mean, that's just, nobody expected this. Nobody saw this coming, or maybe a couple people did, but nobody listened to them. And this is just everybody's up against it. So again, I'm not blaming anybody. We should have done something. We shouldn't have done something. No, I mean, this is reality and we have to deal with it. But that's not to say moving forward we can't put ourselves in a position where perhaps we don't have to deal with it to this degree in the future. And that's something that, that's the one thing, again, the capital gains is one of the issues that we looked at. And something else that the Speaker is very hot on in terms of doing business differently is regionalization. We have, 351 or 352 cities and towns in the Commonwealth, and I think we have 389 school districts or something like that. State of Maryland has about the same number of people and same number of students, and they have, I think the number is 16 school districts. Do the math. I mean, it's very simple. That's 370 some odd superintendents, all of whom make a good salary, as they should. I mean, they do God's work. It's a very difficult job being a school superintendent, but we have 370 of us. I mean, it's just, it's kind of crazy. You get, towns with a fire station on Elm Street in Town A. In Town B, there's a fire station on, Elm Street in that town, and they're half a mile apart. And each town has 6,000 people. Do the math. That's not terribly difficult to figure out. Each town, and the towns are getting away from this, the 911 call centers. Every town would have a call center. Mabel, been in town forever, is the one on it, and she does it, and that's great. But every town has one. I mean, again, why? I mean, it's crazy. So the 911 call centers is something that towns and cities are really getting their arms around now, because just have one. I mean, how tough is that? Technology, computers, we can pull that together. So people are really starting to grasp that, which is good, but we need to get to the school districts. And it's not easy, because you're talking about power struggles, and you're talking about people who are, have their little fiefdoms, and they don't want to give them up. But too bad. I mean, we're getting to the point where we're going to have to tell them to give them up, because we just don't have the dough to continue to do what we do. So part of the budget we put out, and again, I hope the Senate grasps this as well, was it's a commission. Everybody saw the eyes glass over when you hear about commission, but it's a commission to really come together and look at regionalization in a real way. There's a date certain, have to come back with proposals from their legislation and move forward, because again, that's the future of really, really saving money, whether it's public safety, whether it's education, whatever the case may be. So that's something we're looking at as well. And I think I mentioned at the end of the day, probably come June, what are we, May 6th? End of May, early June, the conference committee, as I mentioned, is going to sit down, and we're going to basically rewrite the state budget. And I was telling my members in the House after we did our budget last week, the budget that we ultimately vote on, because we're going to have to vote on it again once it gets passed back from the governor, it's not going to look like anything we just spent 80 hours on last week. But what we did do is we were able to debate and put forward the priorities of the House, and that's what I'm hanging my hat on. So we know where the House wants to go. I'll take those priorities into the conference committee and do the best we can. But again, reality is such that the numbers are the numbers, and we're just going to have to make it balance, and we will. We will. It's going to be. It's not going to be pretty, but that's why I get the big money. No, I know. No, I don't. I don't get big money. But I do, I do look forward to it. So that's what I just wanted to give you the snapshot as to what we're up against, what you're up against as residents. And it's something that we're going to have to get done. FY09, I mentioned that briefly. Fiscal year ends in June. We're about a $900 million out of whack as we sit here today. And that's something we're going to be dealing with over the next couple of weeks. We're meeting with the governor on Monday to talk about a sub-budget to address that. And there are various solves, as they like to call them, to try to come up to find that money. Some of it's going to be the stabilization fund. Some is going to be some federal money and taking money from various trust funds and whatnot. But we'll get there. But that's an issue nobody wants to talk about because nobody wants to talk about it. It's a big issue. It's a big problem, and they just want to deal with it. And again, we will because we have no choice. And then we get to worry about FY10. So I can believe this, but I am an optimist by nature. This job is challenging that, and has from the day I got the job. And I'm just glad I was here to be able to spread some joy. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it.